My name is irrelevant to this story, but what I'm about to tell you has haunted me for nearly 3 decades. I was part of the original investigation team that worked the Jo Jo Dullard case, and what we uncovered goes far deeper than anyone could have imagined. This isn't just about one missing woman. This is about a darkness that consumed an entire region of Ireland, a predator that stalked the countryside, and a system that failed the most vulnerable among us. It was November 9th, 1995, a Thursday night that started like any other, but would end in a way that still gives me nightmares. Josephine Dullard, everyone called her Jo Jo, was just 21 years old, full of life, with auburn hair that caught the light and a smile that could brighten the darkest Irish winter day. She had no idea that night would be her last. No clue that a simple decision to hitchhike home would seal her fate forever. I remember the first time I saw her photograph on my desk. It was 2 days after she'd vanished, and her family was already frantic with worry. Jo Jo wasn't the type to disappear without a word. She was responsible, caring, the kind of young woman who called her mother every day without fail. But that Thursday night, the phone calls stopped, and a family's worst nightmare began. Let me paint you the picture of that evening, because every detail matters when you're trying to understand how evil can masquerade as ordinary kindness. Jo Jo had been out with friends in Naas, County Kildare, about 40 miles from her home in Callan, County Kilkenny. She'd caught a bus from Naas to Moone, a small village that sits like a forgotten outpost along the N9 road. It was around 11:30 at night when she stepped off that bus into the cold November darkness. The plan was simple: hitchhike the remaining 27 miles home to Callan. In 1995, hitchhiking wasn't unusual in rural Ireland. Young people did it all the time, and most drivers were decent folk who'd give you a lift without thinking twice about it. It was a different world then, or at least we thought it was. We hadn't yet understood that monsters could wear the faces of neighbors, that predators could drive ordinary cars and speak with familiar accents. Jo Jo stood by the side of the N9, her thumb extended hopefully toward the southbound traffic. The road was dark and lonely at that hour, with only the occasional set of headlights cutting through the November night. She must have waited there for what felt like an eternity, watching car after car pass by without stopping. I've driven that stretch of road countless times since, trying to imagine what was going through her mind as she stood there in the cold. Then just after midnight, she got lucky, or so she thought. A car pulled over, the driver rolled down his window, and Jo Jo approached with the kind of trust that would cost her everything. We know this because she made a phone call, the last anyone would ever hear from her. At approximately 12:30 in the morning on November 10th, Jo Jo called her friend Mary Cullinane from a phone box in Moone. Her voice was light, almost cheerful, when she told Mary that she'd just gotten a lift from a man who said he'd take her as far as Kilcullen. She sounded relieved, grateful even that someone had stopped for her on such a cold night. "I'm grand," she told Mary, using that distinctly Irish phrase that means everything's okay. But everything wasn't okay, and those would be the last words anyone would ever hear Jo Jo speak. What happened next remains one of the most chilling mysteries in Irish criminal history. Jo Jo never made it to Kilcullen. She never made it home to Callan. She simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. But I know better now. I know that evil took her that night, and I know that her disappearance was just the beginning of something far more sinister. The investigation began immediately when Jo Jo failed to return home the next day. Her family contacted the Gardaí, and we started the process that I've repeated too many times in my career: interviewing witnesses, checking hospitals, following up on sightings that usually lead nowhere. But this case felt different from the start. There was something about the complete absence of evidence, the way Jo Jo had seemingly evaporated into thin air, that set off alarm bells in every experienced investigator who touched the file. We traced her movements that night with meticulous precision. We confirmed she'd been on the bus from Naas to Moone. We verified the phone call to Mary Cullinane. We even found witnesses who remembered seeing a young woman matching Jo Jo's description standing by the roadside near Moone. But after that last phone call, it was as if she'd never existed at all. The search for Jo Jo consumed our lives for weeks, then months, then years. We combed every field, every ditch, every abandoned building within a 50-mile radius of where she was last seen. We dragged rivers and searched forests. We followed up on hundreds of tips and sightings, each one raising our hopes only to dash them again. Psychics came forward with visions and dreams. Concerned citizens reported seeing young women who looked like Jo Jo in places as far away as London and New York. But none of it led anywhere. What made the case even more frustrating was the complete lack of forensic evidence. In 1995, we didn't have the sophisticated DNA analysis and digital tracking capabilities that investigators rely on today. We were working with witness statements, fingerprints, and old-fashioned detective work. The man who picked up Jo Jo that night had left no trace, no clue to his identity beyond the vague description of a car and a voice on the other end of a phone line. But as weeks turned into months, something even more disturbing began to emerge. Jo Jo Dullard wasn't the only young woman who had disappeared from this region of Ireland. As we dug deeper into missing persons reports and cold cases, a pattern started to form that would chill us to the bone. The area where Jo Jo vanished sits at the heart of what would later become known as the Vanishing Triangle, a roughly triangular region of Ireland bounded by Dublin, Galway and Cork, where an unusually high number of women disappeared during the 1990s. These weren't random disappearances spread out over decades. They were concentrated in time and geography in a way that suggested something far more sinister than coincidence. Just 8 months before Jo Jo disappeared, 18-year-old Deirdre Jacob had vanished while walking home from work in Newbridge, County Kildare, less than 20 miles from where Jo Jo was last seen. Deirdre was a sensible, careful young woman who had never given her family cause for worry. She left work at DZ's newsagents at 5:15 in the afternoon and began the short walk to her home. She was seen by several witnesses along the way, but somewhere in those final few hundred yards, she disappeared forever. Then there was Annie McCarrick, a 26-year-old American student who vanished after visiting Johnny Fox's pub in the Dublin Mountains on March 26, 1993. Annie was studying at St. Patrick's College in Maynooth and had fallen in love with Ireland and its people. She was last seen getting on a bus in Dublin, apparently heading to Enniskerry in County Wicklow. Like Jo Jo, she simply vanished without a trace. Eva Brennan, a 39-year-old mother, disappeared from her job at the Leinster Arms pub in Rathvilly, County Carlow, on July 25, 1993. She left work around 12:30 in the morning and was walking the short distance to her home when she vanished. Her house keys were found on the ground the next morning, but Eva was never seen again. As the pattern became clear, a terrible realization began to dawn on all of us working these cases. We weren't dealing with isolated incidents or tragic accidents. We were looking at the work of a predator, someone who was specifically targeting young women in this region of Ireland, someone who had perfected the art of making people disappear. Don't look away now, because what I'm about to reveal is the darkest turn in this story, and it changes everything. The breakthrough came not from our official investigation, but from a chance encounter that still haunts me to this day. In 1998, 3 years after Jo Jo's disappearance, I was working a completely unrelated case when I met a woman I'll call Sarah. She was in her 40s then, living rough on the streets of Dublin, struggling with addiction and the kind of mental health issues that society prefers to ignore. Sarah approached me outside a courthouse where I was testifying on another matter. "You're the guard who's been looking for that girl who disappeared hitchhiking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know something about that night. What Sarah told me would shake the foundation of everything we thought we knew about JoJo's disappearance. She claimed that on the night of November 9th, 1995, she had been working as a prostitute along the N9 road, servicing truck drivers and other travelers who frequented the area. It wasn't uncommon for women in her situation to work those lonely stretches of highway, despite the obvious dangers. According to Sarah, she had seen JoJo standing by the roadside that night, thumb extended, waiting for a lift. But more importantly, she had seen the car that stopped for her. It was a dark-colored saloon car, possibly a Ford or Opel, with a single male driver. Sarah described the man as middle-aged, average height and build, with dark hair and what she called dead eyes. The kind of eyes that looked right through you like you weren't even human. But here's what made my blood run cold. Sarah claimed she had seen this same car with this same driver cruising the N9 corridor multiple times over the previous months. He wasn't just passing through, he was hunting. He would drive slowly along the road, watching for vulnerable women, studying their patterns and behaviors. Sarah said she had felt something wrong about him from the first time she saw him. An instinct that had kept her from ever accepting a ride from him, despite her desperate circumstances. He was looking for a certain type, Sarah told me, her hands shaking as she spoke. Young ones, pretty ones, the kind who still had hope in their eyes. He'd drive by and stare at them like they were meat in a butcher's window. I tried to verify Sarah's account, but the challenges were immense. She was an unreliable witness by any legal standard. Her addiction and mental health issues made her testimony virtually unusable in court. She had no physical evidence, no photographs, no license plate number, just memories of a predator who had been stalking the roads of rural Ireland, selecting his victims with the cold calculation of a hunter choosing prey. But Sarah's account aligned perfectly with what we were seeing in the other disappearances. All of the missing women were young, attractive, and vulnerable in some way. They were either hitchhiking, walking alone at night, or otherwise isolated from help when they vanished. The geographical clustering around the N9 corridor and surrounding areas wasn't coincidence. It was the hunting ground of someone who knew these roads intimately. The more I dug into the case, the more convinced I became that we were dealing with someone local, someone who understood the rhythms of rural Irish life. He knew when young women would be traveling alone, where they would be most vulnerable, and how to approach them without raising suspicion. He was organized, careful, and utterly ruthless in his methods. But perhaps most chilling of all was the realization that he was still out there. JoJo's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident or a crime of passion. It was part of a systematic pattern of predation that showed no signs of stopping. While we were chasing shadows and following dead-end leads, he was likely selecting his next victim. The psychological profile we developed painted a picture of a man who derived satisfaction not just from the crimes themselves, but from the power he held over his victims and their families. The complete absence of bodies or crime scenes wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. He wanted the families to suffer indefinitely, never knowing what had happened to their loved ones, never able to properly grieve or find closure. This psychological warfare extended to the investigation itself. By leaving no physical evidence, no witnesses, no clear pattern that could be easily traced, he was taunting law enforcement. Every dead end we encountered, every false lead we followed, was part of his game. He was demonstrating his superiority, his ability to commit the perfect crime again and again without consequence. As the years passed and the case grew cold, I found myself thinking about JoJo almost daily. I imagined her standing by that dark road on November 9th, 1995, trusting that the stranger who stopped for her was just another decent person offering help to a young woman in need. I thought about the moment when she realized her mistake, when kindness revealed itself as something far more sinister. I wondered if she had time to be afraid, if she understood what was happening to her, if she fought back or tried to escape. The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the whole case. Jo Jo's family, her parents, her siblings, her friends, were left in a state of perpetual limbo. They couldn't properly mourn because there was no body to bury, no definitive proof that Jo Jo was dead, rather than being held somewhere against her will. Hope and despair battled constantly in their hearts, each new lead raising the possibility that she might still be alive, each disappointment crushing them a little bit more. I watched Jo Jo's mother age decades in the span of a few years. The constant stress, the sleepless nights, the endless wondering about her daughter's fate took a terrible toll. She started every day hoping for answers, and ended it with the same gnawing uncertainty that had plagued her since that first morning when Jo Jo didn't come home. It was torture of the most refined sort, not physical pain, but psychological agony that never ended. The media attention, while well-intentioned, sometimes made things worse. Journalists would call on anniversaries of the disappearance, asking for updates, wanting to know if there were any new leads. The family appreciated the publicity because it kept Jo Jo's case in the public eye, but it also meant they could never truly escape the nightmare, never have a day of peace where they didn't have to think about what had happened to their daughter. Meanwhile, the man who had taken Jo Jo remained free, possibly living a normal life in some Irish town or village. He might have been married, might have had children of his own. He could have been someone's neighbor, colleague, or friend, a respected member of the community who hid his true nature behind a facade of ordinary decency. The banality of evil has always been its most terrifying aspect. By 2000, 5 years after Jo Jo's disappearance, I had become something of an expert on the Vanishing Triangle phenomenon. I had studied every case, interviewed every witness, followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. The pattern was undeniable. A predator was operating in this region of Ireland, and he was getting away with it. But the case took another dark turn when we realized that the disappearances hadn't stopped with Jo Jo. In 1996, less than a year after she vanished, 17-year-old Ciara Breen disappeared from her home in Dundalk, County Louth. Like the others, she simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind a family devastated by grief and uncertainty. Fiona Pender, a 25-year-old pregnant woman, disappeared from her apartment in Tullamore, County Offaly, in August 1996. She was 7 months pregnant at the time, making her disappearance even more heartbreaking. Fiona was excited about becoming a mother, looking forward to starting a family with her boyfriend. Instead, both she and her unborn child vanished into the void that seemed to be consuming young women across rural Ireland. Then there was Fiona Sinnott, a 19-year-old mother who disappeared from a pub in Broadway, County Wexford, in February 1998. Fiona had been out for the evening with friends, celebrating at a local establishment. She was last seen leaving the pub with a man, but neither she nor the man were ever seen again. Her 11-month-old daughter was left motherless, another innocent victim of whatever evil was stalking the Irish countryside. Each new disappearance felt like a personal failure. We were supposed to protect people, to solve crimes, to bring justice to victims and their families. But this predator was making fools of us all, demonstrating again and again that he could take whomever he wanted without consequence. The pattern was clear to those of us working the cases, but we couldn't prove anything, couldn't make arrests, couldn't even definitively link the disappearances beyond their geographical and temporal clustering. The frustration was maddening. We had theories, suspects, circumstantial evidence that pointed in various directions, but nothing solid enough to build a case on. Modern forensic science was just beginning to develop the tools that might have helped us. DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated, but we had no biological evidence to analyze. Cell phone tracking existed, but wasn't yet widespread or precise enough to be useful. CCTV cameras were rare in rural Ireland in the 1990s. We were essentially fighting a 21st century predator with 20th century tools, and he was winning. Every month that passed without an arrest meant another month of freedom for someone who had destroyed multiple families and shown no signs of stopping his campaign of terror. The psychological toll on the investigation team was enormous. We were all experienced officers who had worked difficult cases before, but nothing had prepared us for the systematic nature of these disappearances. We were dealing with someone who seemed to view human life as disposable, who could kill and dispose of bodies with the casual efficiency of someone taking out the garbage. Sleep became elusive for many of us. I would lie awake at night, thinking about the women who had vanished, wondering where their bodies might be hidden, whether they had suffered before they died, whether any of them might still be alive somewhere. The not knowing was as difficult for us as it was for the families. We were trained to find answers, to solve puzzles, to bring closure to cases. But this predator had created an unsolvable riddle, a maze with no exit. As 1999 turned into 2000 and then 2001, the case files grew thicker but no less mysterious. We had accumulated thousands of pages of witness statements, hundreds of photographs, countless maps marked with search areas and potential burial sites. But for all our efforts, we were no closer to identifying Jo Jo's killer than we had been on that first day when her photograph landed on my desk. The advancement of DNA technology in the early 2000s gave us new hope. We began re-examining evidence from all the Vanishing Triangle cases, looking for genetic material that might have been missed by earlier analysis. We tested clothing, personal items, anything that might have retained traces of the perpetrator's biological signature. But once again, we found nothing. This was a killer who left no trace, who had either been extremely lucky or was knowledgeable enough about forensic science to avoid detection. By this point, I had developed an almost obsessive relationship with the Jo Jo Dullard case. It had become more than just a professional responsibility. It was a personal mission. I felt like I owed it to Jo Jo, to her family, and to all the other missing women to never give up, to keep searching for answers no matter how long it took. I spent weekends driving the N9 corridor, studying the landscape, trying to think like a predator. Where would someone take a victim? Where would they dispose of a body? The region was full of remote areas, dense forests, abandoned quarries, isolated farms with outbuildings that hadn't been used in decades. It was the perfect hunting ground for someone with evil intentions. But I also began to realize that we might never find Jo Jo's body. If her killer was as organized and careful as he appeared to be, he would have chosen a disposal site that was virtually impossible to discover. Perhaps he had access to industrial equipment that could completely destroy remains. Maybe he had buried her so deep that she would never be found, or disposed of her body in a way that left no trace. The possibility that Jo Jo might never be found, that her family might never have closure, was almost unbearable to contemplate. In Ireland, we have strong traditions around death and burial. The idea of someone's remains lying in an unmarked grave, unknown and unmourned, violated every cultural and religious principle we held dear. As the 10th anniversary of Jo Jo's disappearance approached in 2005, the case received renewed media attention. Newspapers ran retrospective articles about the Vanishing Triangle. Television programs examined the unsolved cases, and the Gardaí made fresh appeals for information. But the anniversary came and went without any significant breakthroughs. The families of the missing women had formed a support group by this time, helping each other cope with the ongoing uncertainty and grief. They organized remembrance services, lobbied for continued police attention to the cases, and provided emotional support to one another. These were people who understood each other's pain in a way that no one else could. But the formation of the support group also highlighted something disturbing: the sheer number of families that had been affected by this predator. We weren't talking about one or two isolated cases, but a systematic campaign of violence against young women that had spanned nearly a decade. The scope of the destruction was almost incomprehensible. I retired from the Garda in 2010, but the Jo Jo Dullard case never really left me. In fact, retirement gave me more time to think about it, to continue researching and following up on leads in an unofficial capacity. I had access to old case files, contacts within law enforcement, and most importantly, the time to pursue theories that might have seemed far-fetched to active investigators with heavy caseloads. One theory that had always intrigued me was the possibility that the Vanishing Triangle killer was someone with professional knowledge of body disposal. Perhaps someone who worked in agriculture, construction, or waste management. The complete absence of remains suggested someone who either had access to specialized equipment or knew techniques for destroying evidence that went beyond what an ordinary killer might know. I spent months researching businesses and individuals in the region who might have had such knowledge. I looked at slaughterhouses, rendering plants, construction companies, quarries, anywhere someone might have learned how to make organic matter disappear completely. But like so many other leads, this avenue of investigation ultimately led nowhere concrete. Another possibility that haunted me was that the killer might have been someone in a position of authority or trust. Perhaps a member of law enforcement, a priest, a doctor, or some other professional who would naturally be trusted by young women. This would explain how he was able to approach victims without arousing suspicion, and might also account for his apparent knowledge of investigative techniques. The thought that a corrupt member of our own organization might have been responsible for these crimes was sickening, but it couldn't be ignored. I quietly investigated several officers who had worked in the region during the relevant time period, looking for any signs of unusual behavior or circumstances that might be suspicious. But again, I found nothing that would stand up to scrutiny, as DNA technology continued to advance through the 2010s. There were periodic attempts to re-examine evidence from the Vanishing Triangle cases, but the fundamental problem remained the same. There was no biological evidence to analyze. The killer had been too careful, too knowledgeable about forensic science, or simply too lucky to leave behind the kind of genetic traces that could identify him. The development of genealogical DNA analysis, the technique used to solve cases like the Golden State Killer in California, offered new hope for cold cases around the world. But this technique still required some starting DNA sample from the perpetrator, which we simply didn't have in the Jo Jo Dullard case. By 2020, 25 years after Jo Jo's disappearance, I had come to accept that the case might never be solved through traditional investigative methods. But I hadn't given up hope that someone, somewhere, knew something that could break the case open. Perhaps someone had information they didn't realize was significant. Maybe someone had suspicions about a family member, friend, or acquaintance that they had never shared with police. That's when I decided to write this account, not as an official police report, but as a personal testimony from someone who had lived with this case for decades. I wanted to tell Jo Jo's story, not just as a criminal investigation, but as a human tragedy that had affected countless lives. I wanted people to understand that behind every cold case file is a real person who was loved and missed, whose absence created a void that could never be filled. Jo Jo Dullard was more than just a victim or a case number. She was a daughter who called her mother every day, a sister who laughed and argued and shared secrets with her siblings, a friend who was loyal and caring to those she loved. She had dreams and plans and expectations for her future that were brutally cut short by someone who viewed her as nothing more than an object for his own twisted gratification. The man who killed Jo Jo robbed not just her of her life, but her family of decades of memories they should have been able to create together. There should have been graduations and career achievements to celebrate, relationships to navigate, perhaps children of her own to spoil and love. Instead, there was only emptiness and questions that would never be answered. But Jo Jo's story is also about more than individual tragedy. It's about a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens, a society that allowed a predator to operate with impunity for years. It's about the limitations of law enforcement in the face of organized, intelligent evil, and the importance of never giving up the search for truth and justice. The Vanishing Triangle phenomenon exposed weaknesses in our approach to investigating serial crimes. The individual cases were handled by different jurisdictions, communication between agencies was inadequate, and there was no systematic approach to identifying patterns that crossed county boundaries. These institutional failures may have allowed the killer to operate longer than he otherwise might have. Since the 1990s, Irish law enforcement has implemented new protocols for handling missing person cases and coordinating multi-jurisdictional investigations. The lessons learned from the Vanishing Triangle cases have been incorporated into training programs and operational procedures. But these improvements came too late for Jo Jo and the other women who disappeared during that dark period. As I write this account in 2024, nearly 30 years after Jo Jo's disappearance, I know that time is running out for any conventional resolution to this case. If the killer is still alive, he would be in his 60s or 70s by now. Witnesses from that era are aging and dying. Physical evidence, already scarce, continues to degrade with each passing year. But I refuse to accept that this case will remain unsolved forever. Somewhere out there, someone knows what happened to Jo Jo Dullard on the night of November 9th, 1995. Maybe it's the killer himself, living with the weight of his crimes and wondering if he'll die before being held accountable. Maybe it's someone who suspects a family member or acquaintance but has never found the courage to come forward. Maybe it's someone who witnessed something suspicious but didn't realize its significance at the time. To anyone who might have information about Jo Jo's disappearance, I want you to know that it's never too late to do the right thing. The passage of time doesn't diminish the importance of truth or the need for justice. Jo Jo's family deserves to know what happened to their daughter, and the other families affected by the Vanishing Triangle deserve answers too. If you're reading this and you know something, anything about what happened to Jo Jo Dullard or any of the other missing women, please find the courage to speak up. Contact the Garda E, call a crime tip line, reach out anonymously if you must, but don't take your knowledge to the grave. These families have suffered enough. The evil that stalked the roads of rural Ireland in the 1990s may have succeeded in hiding its crimes for decades, but it has not succeeded in erasing the memory of its victims. Jo Jo Dullard's name is still spoken, her photograph is still shared, her story is still told. She has not been forgotten, and neither have the other women who vanished into the darkness of the Vanishing Triangle. Their disappearances changed Ireland in fundamental ways. We became more cautious, more suspicious of strangers, more aware of the dangers that could lurk behind friendly facades. Parents held their children closer. Young women were more careful about traveling alone, and society as a whole lost some of its innocence about the nature of evil in our midst. But we also became more determined to seek justice, more sophisticated in our investigative techniques, and more committed to supporting the families of victims. The tragedy of the Vanishing Triangle led to important reforms in how missing person cases are handled, how multi-jurisdictional investigations are coordinated, and how forensic evidence is preserved and analyzed. These improvements are Jo Jo's legacy, along with the other missing women. Their disappearances were not in vain if they led to changes that prevented other families from experiencing the same heartbreak. Every case that gets solved more quickly because of improved protocols, every predator who gets caught because of better inter-agency cooperation, every family that gets closure because of advanced forensic techniques. These are monuments to the women of the Vanishing Triangle. As I conclude this account, I want to return to where it all began, with Jo Jo Dullard standing by the side of the N9 road on a cold November night in 1995. She was young, hopeful, trusting in the basic decency of human nature. She believed that the stranger who stopped to offer her a ride was just another kind person helping out a fellow traveler. That trust, that fundamental belief in the goodness of others, was both beautiful and tragically misplaced. Jo Jo's story is a reminder that evil often wears the mask of normalcy, that predators can appear as ordinary as anyone else, that monsters don't always look like monsters. But it's also a testament to the power of love and determination, to families who never give up searching for truth, to investigators who carry cases in their hearts long after retirement, to communities that refuse to let victims be forgotten. If you've stayed with me through this long, dark journey into one of Ireland's most haunting, unsolved mysteries, I want you to understand that this isn't just ancient history or distant tragedy. The person who killed Jo Jo Dullard may still be alive. He may still be living among us, hiding in plain sight, carrying the secret of what he did to a young woman who simply wanted to get home to her family. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves eventually. Truth has a persistence that outlasts lies, and justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of finding its mark. The story of Jo Jo Dullard isn't over yet. Somewhere in the darkness, there are still answers waiting to be found, still truth waiting to be revealed, still justice waiting to be served. Don't let this story end here. Share Jo Jo's story with others. Keep her memory alive, and never stop believing that someday, somehow, the truth about what happened on that November night will finally come to light. Subscribe to stay updated on developments in this case and others like it. Share this story with everyone you know, because the more people who know Jo Jo's story, the greater the chance that someone will come forward with the information that finally brings her killer to justice. The darkness may have claimed Jo Jo Dullard, but it will never claim her memory, her story, or the love of those who refuse to forget her. In that refusal to forget, in that determination to keep seeking truth, there is a light that no amount of darkness can extinguish. And maybe, just maybe, that light will finally illuminate the answers we've been searching for all these years.